Girl screams. Every time her dad touches her shoulder, teacher installs hidden camera. The October morning air carried the scent of burning leaves through the open windows of Millbrook High School, but Emma Patterson barely noticed. She sat in her usual spot in the back corner of her AP English classroom, shoulders hunched forward, dark hair creating a protective curtain around her face. The familiar weight of anxiety pressed against her chest like a stone, making each breath feel deliberate and measured. Emma had perfected the art of invisibility over her 17 years in Millbrook, in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where families had roots stretching back generations. She had somehow managed to remain a ghost. She attended every class, completed every assignment with meticulous care, and maintained a 3.8 GPA, yet most of her classmates couldn't tell you the color of her eyes or recall hearing her voice more than a handful of times each semester. "All right, everyone, let's move into our discussion groups for the Gatsby analysis," Mr. Davidson announced, his voice cutting through the morning chatter. "Same groups as yesterday. Emma, you're with Jessica, Marcus, and Tyler." Emma's stomach dropped. Group work was her personal hell, a special kind of torture that required her to sit close to others, to speak up, to make eye contact. She watched as chairs scraped against the linoleum floor, and her classmates began rearranging themselves into clusters around the room. Jessica Chen bounced over with her perpetual smile, her long black hair swinging as she pulled her chair close to Emma's desk. "Hey, Emma, I loved your insights yesterday about the green light symbolism. You really get Fitzgerald in a way that—" Jessica's hand landed on Emma's shoulder as she leaned in to whisper conspiratorially about their shared love of literature. The touch was gentle, friendly, completely innocent, and Emma's body reacted as if she'd been struck by lightning. "Don't!" The word exploded from Emma's lips, sharp and panicked. She jerked away so violently that her chair tilted backward, nearly sending her tumbling to the floor. Her face flushed crimson as 23 pairs of eyes turned toward her, conversation stopping mid-sentence. Jessica's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and hurt. "Oh my God, Emma, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to." "It's fine," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible as she gripped the edges of her desk, knuckles white. "I'm fine. It's fine." But it wasn't fine. The classroom felt like it was shrinking, the walls pressing closer with each passing second. Emma could hear the whispered conversation starting up around her, could feel the weight of curious stares and pitying glances. Marcus Henderson, the starting quarterback whose family owned half the businesses on Main Street, shook his head with barely concealed disgust. "Jesus, what's wrong with her?" he muttered to Tyler, though his voice carried farther than he intended. "She acts like people have the plague or something." Tyler Morrison, whose father was the town sheriff, had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Maybe she just doesn't like being touched, man. Some people are like that." "It's weird," Marcus continued, apparently oblivious to Emma's proximity. "My mom says her family's always been strange. Remember when we were kids and she'd never come to birthday parties? Never spoke to anyone at recess? It's like she thinks she's better than everyone else." The words hit Emma like physical blows. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor and never resurface. Her breathing became shallow and rapid, and she recognized the familiar signs of an approaching panic attack. The rational part of her mind knew she needed to leave, to find somewhere quiet to collect herself, but her body felt frozen in place. Mr. Davidson had been watching the exchange with growing concern. David Davidson was 42 years old, had been teaching for nearly 2 decades, and had developed a keen eye for students who were struggling beneath the surface. In his years at Millbrook High, he'd seen shy kids, rebellious kids, troubled kids from difficult home situations, but Emma Patterson was different. There was something about the way she moved through the world, like she was perpetually braced for impact, that had caught his attention from the first day of school. "All right, let's refocus on the assignment," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the uncomfortable atmosphere. "We've got limited time, and I want to hear some thoughtful analysis. Marcus, why don't you start us off with your thoughts on Nick Carraway's reliability as a narrator?" The attention shifted away from Emma, but she could still feel the occasional glance, still hear the whispered speculation. She forced herself to participate minimally in the group discussion, offering one-word answers when directly addressed, her voice so quiet that Jessica had to lean forward to hear her. But she didn't pull away when Jessica moved closer this time. She simply sat rigid as a statue, every muscle in her body tense. When the bell finally rang, Emma was the first to gather her belongings and head for the door. but Mr. Davidson's voice stopped her. "Emma, could you stay back for just a minute? I'd like to speak with you about your essay draft." Her heart hammered against her ribs. Being singled out was almost as terrifying as group work, but she couldn't ignore a direct request from a teacher. She waited by his desk as the classroom emptied, her backpack clutched against her chest like armor. Mr. Davidson closed the door and returned to his desk, but he didn't sit down. Instead, he leaned against the front edge, keeping a respectful distance between them. Emma appreciated that he seemed to understand her need for space. "Your essay about isolation themes in American literature was exceptional," he began, and Emma felt a flicker of surprise. She'd expected a lecture about her behavior, not praise for her work. "Your analysis of how authors use physical and emotional distance to explore the human condition, it showed real insight, college-level insight." Emma's cheeks flushed again, but this time with something closer to pride than embarrassment. Writing was the one area where she felt confident, where her thoughts flowed freely without the obstacle of spoken words. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm wondering if you'd be interested in entering the state writing competition this year. The theme is Finding Voice in Silent Spaces, which seems right up your alley." The irony wasn't lost on Emma. Finding voice in silent spaces, wasn't that exactly what she'd been trying to do her entire life? But the thought of her writing being read by strangers, judged by people she'd never met, sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her system. I don't know. I'm not really good with people reading my stuff." Mr. Davidson nodded thoughtfully. "What if we started smaller? There's a creative writing club that meets after school on Wednesdays. Very small group, usually just 4 or 5 students. They're good kids, very supportive. It might be a way to share your work in a safe environment." Emma's first instinct was to refuse immediately. The idea of voluntarily putting herself in another social situation, especially one centered around sharing personal creative work, felt impossible. But something about Mr. Davidson's manner, patient, non-pressuring, genuinely interested in her thoughts rather than trying to fix her, made her pause. "Can I think about it?" she asked. "Of course. The invitation's always open." Emma nodded and headed for the door, but Mr. Davidson's voice stopped her again. "Emma, what happened earlier, with Jessica touching your shoulder? That's okay, you know. Everyone has boundaries. Everyone has things that make them uncomfortable. That doesn't make you strange or wrong." The words followed Emma into the hallway, echoing in her mind as she navigated the crowded corridors toward her next class. She'd spent so many years believing that her reactions were proof of her fundamental brokenness, evidence that she was indeed as weird and damaged as people like Marcus believed. But Mr. Davidson's matter-of-fact acceptance, his casual acknowledgement that her boundaries were valid, planted a small seed of possibility in her chest. The rest of the school day passed in its usual blur of anxiety and careful navigation. Emma ate lunch alone in the library as she had every day since freshman year. She chose a table in the far corner, behind the biography section where foot traffic was minimal. The librarian, Mrs. Kowalski, had long ago stopped trying to encourage her to sit with other students, accepting Emma's need for solitude with the same quiet understanding that made the library Emma's safe haven. As she unwrapped her peanut butter sandwich, the same lunch she'd brought every day since middle school because routine felt safer than unpredictability, Emma found herself thinking about Mr. Davidson's suggestion. A writing club, a place where words mattered more than social performance, where maybe her thoughts could exist without the filter of spoken awkwardness. She pulled out her phone and opened the Notes app, where she kept fragments of stories and observations that occurred to her throughout the day. Today's entry was brief but raw. "Sometimes I wonder if other people feel like they're walking around without skin, like every casual touch or unexpected sound goes straight to their nerve endings. Or if I'm just broken in some fundamental way that can't be fixed. Jessica's touch wasn't meant to hurt, but my body reacted like she was attacking me. Is that normal? Is anything about me normal?" The words stared back at her from the screen, honest and painful in their simplicity. Emma had been keeping these digital journal entries for months now, a way of processing the constant internal monologue that she could never speak aloud. Writing had always been her outlet, the one place where her thoughts could exist without judgment or interruption. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Pick up milk on your way home. Dad's working late again." Emma's father, Robert Patterson, was a regional manager for a medical supply company, a job that required frequent travel and long hours. Her mother, Linda, worked part-time at the town's only real estate office, and spent most of her free time volunteering for various community organizations. They were good parents, loving in their own way, but they'd never quite known what to do with their quiet, anxious daughter who seemed to shrink away from the very social connections that came so naturally to them. They'd tried therapy when Emma was 13, and her anxiety had reached a peak that made attending school nearly impossible. Dr. Morrison, no relation to Tyler, had been kind but ultimately ineffective, his attempts to get Emma to open up only making her retreat further into herself. After 6 months of awkward sessions that felt more like interrogations, Emma had begged her parents to let her stop, promising that she would try harder to be normal, and she had tried. She'd developed elaborate coping mechanisms, careful routines that allowed her to function in social situations without completely falling apart. She'd learned to anticipate potential triggers, to position herself in classrooms and hallways where unexpected contact was less likely. She'd perfected the art of participating just enough to avoid negative attention, while never contributing so much that she became the center of focus. But lately, the effort of maintaining these careful facades was becoming exhausting. Emma felt like she was constantly performing a role, the role of a normal teenager, without ever being able to simply exist as herself. The final bell of the day rang, and Emma gathered her belongings with practiced efficiency. She had a system for leaving school that minimized contact with other students. Wait for the initial rush to clear, take the side exit near the gymnasium, walk the long way around the building to avoid the main student parking lot. It added 10 minutes to her journey home, but it was worth it to avoid the chaos of hundreds of teenagers all trying to leave at once. As she walked along Maple Street toward downtown Millbrook, Emma allowed herself to really look at her hometown for the first time in months. The October afternoon light cast everything in warm, golden tones, highlighting the historic brick buildings that lined Main Street and the mature trees that gave the town its quintessential small-town America charm. Window boxes overflowed with fall mums and decorative gourds, and several shops had already begun putting up Halloween decorations. Millbrook was the kind of place where people moved to raise families, where high school football games drew half the town's population, where everyone knew your name and your business, whether you wanted them to or not. For many people, it was idyllic. For Emma, it felt like living under a microscope. She stopped at Patterson's Market, no relation to her family despite the shared name, to pick up the milk her mother had requested. Mrs. Sullivan, who'd worked the afternoon shift for as long as Emma could remember, smiled warmly as she approached the counter. "How's school going, honey? Your mama mentioned you're in all those advanced classes this year." Emma nodded, managing a small smile in return. Mrs. Sullivan was one of the few adults in town who'd never tried to force conversation beyond these brief, comfortable exchanges. She seemed to understand that some people preferred quiet interactions, and Emma was grateful for that understanding. "It's going well, thank you," Emma replied, handing over exact change as always. "You tell your parents I said hello, all right?" "I will." The walk home took another 15 minutes, leading Emma through the residential streets where she'd spent her entire life. Her house was a modest 2-story colonial with blue shutters and a wraparound porch that her mother had decorated with seasonal flowers and wooden signs bearing inspirational quotes. It looked like the kind of home where a happy, well-adjusted family would live, which Emma supposed they were in their own way. She let herself in through the front door, calling out a greeting to her mother, who was in the kitchen starting dinner preparations. Linda Patterson was a petite woman with graying blonde hair and boundless energy, the kind of person who could organize a charity fundraiser, coordinate a neighborhood block party, and still have dinner on the table by 6 o'clock. "How was school, sweetheart?" Linda asked, accepting the milk with a grateful smile. "Fine," Emma replied automatically. It was always fine. Even when it wasn't fine, it was fine. "I ran into Jessica Chen's mother at the grocery store this morning. She mentioned that Jessica really enjoys having you in her English class, said you have wonderful insights about literature." Emma felt a familiar twist of anxiety in her stomach. The incident from that morning, her violent reaction to Jessica's friendly touch, felt like it had happened years ago rather than hours. She wondered if Jessica had mentioned it to her mother, if the story was already making its rounds through Millbrook's efficient gossip network. "Jessica's nice," Emma said carefully. "Maybe you two could study together sometime? I know your father and I have always worried that you spend too much time alone." "I'm fine, Mom. Really." Linda's expression softened with the particular brand of worry that Emma had grown accustomed to seeing in her parents' eyes. It was the look that said they loved her but didn't quite understand her, that they wanted to help but didn't know how. "I know you are, honey. I just want you to know that it's okay to let people in sometimes. You don't have to carry everything by yourself." Emma nodded, kissed her mother's cheek, and headed upstairs to her room. It was her sanctuary, decorated in soft blues and grays, with built-in bookshelves lining one wall and a window seat that looked out over the backyard. Her desk was positioned to catch the afternoon light, and it was there that she did her homework, wrote in her journal, and worked on the stories that lived only in her computer files. She settled at her desk and opened her laptop, pulling up the document she'd been working on for the past few weeks. It was a short story about a girl who could only communicate through written letters, living in a world where everyone else spoke in colors and music. The metaphor wasn't subtle, but it felt true to Emma's experience of moving through a world where everyone else seemed to possess some innate social knowledge that she'd never learned. As she wrote, Emma found herself thinking again about Mr. Davidson's suggestion, a writing club, a place where her words might matter more than her social awkwardness, where maybe she could connect with other people through the one medium that felt natural to her. For the first time in years, Emma allowed herself to consider the possibility that maybe she wasn't as alone as she'd always believed. Maybe there were other people who understood what it felt like to exist on the margins, who found their voices not in spoken words but in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, in the careful construction of sentences that could say what their hearts couldn't speak aloud. The idea was terrifying and thrilling in equal measure, and as Emma continued writing, she felt something shift inside her chest, a tiny crack in the wall she'd built around herself, allowing the faintest possibility of light to seep through. Outside her window, the October afternoon faded into evening, and Emma wrote on, losing herself in the familiar rhythm of keys clicking and words appearing on screen, where her thoughts could exist without fear of judgment or misunderstanding. Tomorrow would bring another day of careful navigation through social minefields, but tonight, in the safety of her room and the company of her own words, Emma allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to be truly seen and understood. The seed that Mr. Davidson had planted earlier that day took root in the quiet of her bedroom, growing stronger with each word she typed, each honest sentence that flowed from her fingers onto the screen. Change, Emma was beginning to realize, didn't always arrive with fanfare and dramatic gestures. Sometimes it crept in quietly, disguised as a teacher's casual suggestion or a moment of unexpected understanding, planting itself in the fertile ground of a lonely heart and waiting patiently for the right conditions to bloom. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of Pennsylvania October weather that made everything feel muted and subdued. Emma stood at her bedroom window, watching raindrops trace erratic paths down the glass, and felt the familiar weight of another school day pressing against her consciousness. Her reflection stared back at her from the window, pale skin, dark circles under brown eyes that seemed too large for her face, shoulder-length brown hair that she wore loose because ponytails made her feel too exposed. She'd spent most of the previous evening thinking about Mr. Davidson's invitation to the writing club, the possibility circling through her mind like a moth around a flame. Part of her desperately wanted to believe that there might be a place where she could exist authentically, where her words could build bridges instead of walls. But the larger part, the part that had kept her safe for 17 years, whispered warnings about vulnerability and the inevitable disappointment that came with hope. Downstairs, her parents were engaged in their usual morning routine, her father gulping coffee while scrolling through emails on his phone, her mother packing lunches and mentally organizing her day. They moved around each other with the practiced efficiency of a couple married for 22 years, comfortable in their shared rhythms. "Morning, sweetheart," Linda said as Emma entered the kitchen. "I made your sandwich. Extra peanut butter, just how you like it." "Thanks, Mom." Robert looked up from his phone, his expression softening as it always did when he looked at his daughter. Emma had inherited his tendency toward introversion, though his manifested as quiet thoughtfulness rather than debilitating anxiety. He understood her need for solitude better than his wife did, perhaps because he recognized something of himself in Emma's careful navigation of social situations. "Drive safely today," he said, pressing a quick kiss to the top of her head. "Weather's supposed to get worse this afternoon." Emma nodded, accepting the familiar comfort of routine. Her parents' predictable concern, their gentle attempts to connect without overwhelming her, had become the background music of her life. They loved her, she knew that, but she also knew they worried about her in ways they tried not to show. The drive to school took 12 minutes through Millbrook's quiet residential streets. Emma had gotten her license the day she turned 16, not out of any burning desire for independence, but because driving herself meant controlling her environment, avoiding the social minefield of school buses and carpools. Her car, a reliable if unspectacular Honda Civic that had been her grandmother's, was another sanctuary, a small space where she could exist without performance or pretense. She parked in her usual spot at the far end of the student lot, away from the clusters of cars where groups of friends gathered before school. Through her windshield, she watched the familiar social choreography of teenage life, the popular kids claiming their territory near the main entrance, the athletes joking and shoving each other with easy camaraderie, the various social subgroups maintaining their careful boundaries and alliances. Emma had spent years observing these interactions with the detached fascination of an anthropologist. She could map the social hierarchies, predict the friendship dynamics, understand the unspoken rules that governed teenage behavior, but understanding and participating were entirely different skills, and she'd never mastered the latter. A tap on her passenger window made her jump, her heart immediately accelerating to panic speed. Tyler Morrison stood outside her car, his sheriff's badge backpack slung over his shoulder, gesturing for her to roll down the window. Emma's first instinct was to pretend she hadn't seen him, to wait until he gave up and walked away, but something in his expression, earnest rather than mocking, made her hesitate. She cracked the window an inch, just enough to hear him speak. "Hey, Emma, can I talk to you for a second?" Every fiber of her being screamed at her to make an excuse, to avoid whatever awkward interaction was about to unfold. But Tyler had been one of the few people yesterday who hadn't joined in Marcus's commentary about her weirdness, and curiosity won out over anxiety. She rolled the window down halfway, still maintaining the barrier of glass and metal between them. "I wanted to apologize for yesterday," Tyler said, his breath visible in the cool morning air. "For what Marcus said, I mean. That was uncool, and I should have shut it down instead of just sitting there." Emma stared at him, genuinely surprised. In her experience, people rarely acknowledged uncomfortable moments, preferring to pretend they'd never happened. The fact that Tyler had not only noticed her discomfort, but felt compelled to address it was so unexpected that she forgot to be anxious for a moment. "It's okay," she said quietly. "You don't have to apologize for other people. Maybe not, but I should apologize for myself. I've been in classes with you since elementary school, and I realized yesterday that I don't know anything about you except that you're really smart and really quiet. That's on me." Tyler paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. Emma found herself actually listening, rather than simply enduring the interaction until it ended. "My sister has social anxiety," he continued. "She's away at college now, but high school was really hard for her. She used to say that people treated her like she was contagious or something, like being shy was a character flaw instead of just the way she was built." Emma felt something shift in her chest. Recognition, maybe, or the unfamiliar sensation of being understood by someone her own age. She'd never heard anyone talk about anxiety as simply a different way of being built, rather than something that needed to be fixed or overcome. "I don't really know how to be around people," she admitted, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "That's okay," Tyler said simply. "Not everyone has to be a social butterfly. The world probably needs more people who think before they speak." The first bell rang, signaling 10 minutes until classes began. Tyler hitched his backpack higher on his shoulder and took a step back from her car. "Anyway, I just wanted you to know that what Marcus said, that's his issue, not yours. You don't owe anyone an explanation for who you are." He walked away before Emma could respond, leaving her sitting in her car with a strange warmth spreading through her chest. It was such a small interaction, barely 5 minutes of conversation, but it felt monumental. Someone had seen her discomfort, acknowledged it, and offered understanding instead of judgment. Emma gathered her belongings and made her way toward the school building, Tyler's words echoing in her mind. "You don't owe anyone an explanation for who you are." It was a radical concept for someone who'd spent her entire life feeling like she needed to justify her existence, to apologize for taking up space in a world that seemed designed for people more outgoing than herself. First period was AP History with Mrs. Chen, Jessica's mother as it happened. Emma had always appreciated Mrs. Chen's teaching style, which relied more on thoughtful analysis than group discussion. She could participate through written assignments and the occasional raised hand, contributing to class without the pressure of constant social interaction. Today we're going to examine primary source documents from the Great Depression, Mrs. Chen announced, distributing packets of letters and newspaper clippings. I want you to work in pairs to analyze how these personal accounts reflect the broader historical narrative we've been studying. Emma's stomach dropped. Pair work was almost as anxiety-inducing as group work, requiring sustained one-on-one interaction with a classmate. She began the familiar mental calculation of how to minimize the social demands while still participating enough to avoid drawing negative attention. Emma, would you like to work together? She looked up to find Jessica standing beside her desk, holding her packet of documents. Yesterday's incident hung between them like a fragile bridge. Jessica's innocent touch, Emma's violent reaction, the moment of mutual confusion and embarrassment that had left them both uncertain. If you want to, Emma said carefully, surprised by Jessica's willingness to approach her again. Jessica pulled a chair over to Emma's desk, but this time she was careful to maintain physical distance, settling herself with enough space that accidental contact would be impossible. The gesture was subtle but significant, showing that she'd paid attention to Emma's boundaries and chosen to respect them rather than dismiss them. I found some really interesting letters here, Jessica said, spreading the documents between them. This one's from a woman in Oklahoma writing to her sister in California about the dust storms. Listen to this part. As Jessica read aloud, Emma found herself relaxing into the familiar comfort of academic discussion. Literature and history were safe territories where she could engage intellectually without the minefield of personal revelation. They worked together quietly, Jessica carrying most of the verbal analysis while Emma contributed through careful written notes that Jessica incorporated into their shared understanding. You see connections that I miss, Jessica said as they compiled their findings. Like how you linked the Dust Bowl letters to the industrial displacement we read about last week. I never would have made that connection. Emma felt a flush of pride. Academic recognition was one of the few forms of positive attention she could accept without anxiety, partly because it felt earned rather than given out of pity or social obligation. I like seeing patterns, she said quietly. How things connect even when they seem separate. That's such a valuable skill. I bet you'd be amazing at research, like really deep investigative stuff where you have to piece together information from different sources. The idea hadn't occurred to Emma before, but as Jessica said it, she felt a spark of interest. She'd always been drawn to puzzles, to the satisfaction of finding hidden connections and underlying structures. Maybe there were career paths that would value those skills, ways to contribute meaningfully to the world without having to navigate complex social dynamics. Their conversation was interrupted by Marcus Henderson's voice from across the room, loud enough to carry over the general classroom chatter. I don't get why we have to care about this old stuff. Like these people are all dead. Their problems are solved. Why can't we focus on things that actually matter? Mrs. Chen's response was patient but firm. History helps us understand patterns of human behavior, Marcus. The economic and social challenges of the Depression have parallels to issues we face today. Understanding how people survived and adapted can inform our approach to current problems. But it's just depressing, Marcus continued, apparently oblivious to the irony of his word choice. I mean, look at this letter from some farmer who lost everything. What's the point of reading about people's misery? Emma felt a familiar flush of frustration. Marcus's casual dismissal of human suffering, his inability to see value in experiences different from his own, represented everything she found exhausting about social interaction. The lack of empathy, the assumption that his perspective was universal, the confidence with which he dismissed things he didn't immediately understand. The point, she said, her voice carrying farther than she'd intended, is that these people found ways to survive things that seemed impossible. They created support networks, developed new skills, maintained hope when everything they'd known was falling apart. That's not depressing, that's inspiring. The classroom fell quiet, 23 pairs of eyes turning toward Emma's corner. She immediately regretted speaking up, her face burning with the familiar flush of unwanted attention, but Mrs. Chen's approving nod and Jessica's encouraging smile reminded her that not all attention was negative. Exactly, Emma, Mrs. Chen said. These personal accounts show us human resilience in action. They demonstrate that people can adapt and survive even under the most challenging circumstances. Marcus looked annoyed at being contradicted, but before he could respond, the bell rang, ending the period. As students began gathering their belongings, Emma focused on packing her materials with methodical precision. trying to ignore the curious glances and whispered conversations that always followed any moment when she stepped outside her usual invisibility. "That was really well said," Jessica told her as they prepared to leave. "You should speak up more often. You have good insights." Emma managed a small smile, though the suggestion of speaking up more often sent anxiety spiraling through her system. One moment of unexpected participation was challenging enough. The idea of making it a regular occurrence felt overwhelming. "Thanks for being a good partner," she said instead, deflecting Jessica's encouragement while acknowledging her kindness. As they walked toward the door, Jessica hesitated, then spoke quietly. "I hope I didn't make you uncomfortable yesterday. I know some people don't like being touched, and I should have asked first." Emma felt that same surprise she'd experienced with Tyler, the unexpected recognition that her boundaries might be valid rather than pathological. "It's not your fault," she said. "I just react badly to unexpected contact. It's not personal. Would it help if I asked first? Like, if we're working together and I need to point something out on your paper or whatever?" The question was so simple, so practical, yet it represented something Emma had never experienced. Someone adapting their behavior to accommodate her needs without making her feel broken or burdensome. Most people either ignored her boundaries entirely or treated them like a personal rejection. "That would help," Emma admitted. "Thank you for asking." They parted ways in the hallway, Jessica heading toward the science wing while Emma made her way to AP Chemistry. The morning's interactions, Tyler's understanding, Jessica's accommodation, even her own unexpected moment of speaking up in history class, had left Emma feeling slightly off balance, as if the familiar weight of social anxiety had shifted just enough to allow room for something new. Chemistry was taught by Mr. Rodriguez, a young teacher in his third year who brought enthusiasm and energy to a subject that many students found intimidating. Emma appreciated his teaching style, which emphasized understanding concepts rather than memorizing formulas, and she'd consistently earned A's in his class. "Today we're going to explore molecular bonding through a hands-on lab," Mr. Rodriguez announced as students settled into their seats. "You'll be working with lab partners to create different types of bonds and observe their properties." Emma's lab partner was Sarah Kim, a quiet Korean-American girl who shared Emma's preference for working steadily without unnecessary conversation. They'd been paired together several times throughout the semester, developing an efficient collaboration based on mutual respect for each other's working styles. "Want to start with the ionic bonds?" Sarah asked, already reaching for the necessary materials. Emma nodded, grateful for a partner who didn't expect constant chatter or social bonding as part of their academic work. They fell into their usual rhythm, Sarah handling the more physically demanding aspects of the experiment, while Emma took detailed notes and made observations about the chemical processes they were witnessing. As they worked, Emma found herself thinking about the morning's conversations. Tyler's sister, who'd struggled with social anxiety in high school, Jessica's willingness to accommodate her boundaries without making her feel abnormal, the growing realization that maybe her way of being in the world wasn't as unique or pathological as she'd always believed. "Emma, can you check my calculations on this reaction?" Sarah asked, sliding her notebook across the lab bench. Emma reviewed the work, catching a small error in the stoichiometry that would have thrown off their results. "The coefficient here should be 3, not 2, she said, pointing to the equation. "Thanks. I always miss those details." It was such a simple exchange, but it reminded Emma of something important. She did have value to offer, skills and insights that could help others even if she couldn't navigate casual social conversation with ease. Her attention to detail, her ability to spot patterns and connections, her careful analytical thinking. These weren't consolation prizes for her social struggles. They were genuine strengths. The lab period passed quickly, and as Emma cleaned their workstation, she noticed Mr. Rodriguez approaching. "Emma, could I speak with you for a moment?" he asked. Her anxiety immediately spiked. Being singled out by teachers often meant she'd done something wrong, made some social misstep that needed correction. But Mr. Rodriguez's expression was friendly rather than concerned. "I've been impressed with your work this semester," he said as other students filed out of the classroom. "Your lab reports show real analytical thinking, and your test scores are among the highest in the class. Have you given any thought to what you might want to study in college?" The question caught Emma off guard. She'd been so focused on simply surviving high school that she'd barely considered what might come after. College felt like a distant possibility, something that belonged to confident people who could navigate dormitory life and lecture halls full of strangers. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "I like science, but I don't know if I'm good enough for a real career in it." "Good enough?" Mr. Rodriguez looked genuinely surprised. "Emma, you have exactly the kind of mind that science needs. You're thorough. You ask thoughtful questions. You don't jump to conclusions without evidence. Those are the qualities that make great researchers." Emma felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. "Do you really think so?" "I know so. There are lots of different paths in science: research labs, environmental consulting, medical technology, data analysis. Many of them don't require the kind of constant social interaction that some people find challenging, but they do require the kind of careful, analytical thinking that comes naturally to you." The conversation continued for a few more minutes. Mr. Rodriguez sharing information about college programs and career paths that Emma had never considered. As she left the classroom, she felt something shifting in her perspective. For the first time, she began to envision a future where her natural tendencies might be assets rather than obstacles. Lunchtime arrived with its usual dilemma: endure the cafeteria's social chaos or retreat to the library's peaceful solitude. Emma chose the library, as always, but today she found herself thinking about Mr. Davidson's writing club invitation with less immediate terror than before. Mrs. Kowalski, the librarian, looked up from her computer as Emma settled into her usual corner table. "How's the day treating you, dear?" "Better than expected," Emma replied, surprising herself with the honesty of the answer. "Those are the best kind of days," Mrs. Kowalski said with a warm smile. "The ones that sneak up on you with little gifts." As Emma ate her sandwich and worked on homework, she reflected on the morning's little gifts: Tyler's understanding, Jessica's accommodation, her own moment of unexpected participation in history class, Mr. Rodriguez's encouragement about her future possibilities. None of them were earth-shattering events, but together they created a subtle shift in how she saw herself and her place in the world. She pulled out her phone and opened her notes app, adding to her ongoing digital journal. "Maybe I'm not as broken as I thought. Maybe the problem isn't that I'm defective, but that I've been trying to fit into spaces that weren't designed for people like me." Tyler's sister made it through high school with social anxiety. Mr. Rodriguez thinks I could have a real career in science. Jessica wants to understand my boundaries instead of pushing past them. Maybe there are places in the world where being careful and analytical and quiet are actually valued. The words stared back at her from the screen, radical in their suggestion that she might be acceptable as she was rather than as a project to be fixed. Emma had spent so many years focused on her deficits, her inability to make casual conversation, her discomfort with physical contact, her tendency to freeze up in social situations, that she'd never seriously considered her strengths. But they existed, didn't they? Her teachers consistently praised her academic work. She could spot patterns and connections that others missed. She listened carefully and observed details that escaped more socially focused people. These weren't character flaws masquerading as virtues. They were genuine skills that had value in the world. The afternoon passed more quickly than usual. In AP English, Mr. Davidson returned their latest essays with his characteristic detailed feedback. Emma's paper, an analysis of isolation themes in contemporary literature, had received an A+, along with a note: "Your insights into how modern authors use physical and emotional distance to explore human connection are sophisticated and original. This is exactly the kind of thinking that would flourish in a creative writing environment." The writing club invitation, unspoken but clearly implied, hovered in the air between them. Emma caught Mr. Davidson's eye and saw patient encouragement there, the same non-pressuring support he'd offered the day before. He wasn't pushing her toward a decision, but he was keeping the door open, allowing her to choose when and if she was ready to walk through it. As the final bell rang and students began their exodus from the building, Emma found herself walking more slowly than usual. The day had been full of small revelations, tiny shifts in perspective that added up to something significant. She wasn't transformed. She was still anxious about social interaction, still preferred solitude to crowds, still jumped when people touched her unexpectedly. But for the first time in years, she was beginning to believe that these characteristics might not define the limits of her life. The drive home took her through downtown Millbrook, past the familiar storefronts and tree-lined streets that had formed the backdrop of her entire existence. Today, instead of feeling trapped by the town's small-scale intimacy, she found herself noticing details she'd overlooked before. The bookstore with its hand-painted sign and window display of local authors, the coffee shop where college students from the community college gathered with their laptops, the small park where families brought their children to play. Maybe Millbrook wasn't the problem. Maybe the problem was that she'd been so focused on what she couldn't do, where she didn't fit, that she'd never looked for places where she might belong. At home, her mother was in the kitchen preparing dinner, humming softly as she chopped vegetables. The familiar sounds and smells of home wrapped around Emma like a comfortable blanket, reminding her that she was loved and valued even when she felt isolated from the larger world. "How was school today?" Linda asked, looking up from her cutting board. For once, Emma paused to consider the question seriously instead of offering her automatic, "Fine." "Actually pretty good," she said. "I had some interesting conversations." Linda's face lit up with surprised pleasure. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Anyone special?" Emma thought about Tyler's apology, Jessica's accommodation, Mr. Rodriguez's encouragement, Mr. Davidson's continuing invitation. "Just people being kinder than I expected. People can surprise you sometimes," Linda said softly, "when you give them the chance." The words followed Emma upstairs to her room, where she settled at her desk and opened her laptop. Instead of working on homework, she found herself creating a new document, her fingers moving across the keyboard with growing confidence. What if the writing club isn't as terrifying as I think it is? What if it's just a few people who care more about words than social performance? What if Mr. Davidson is right, and there's a place where my thoughts could exist without having to be filtered through the anxiety of spoken interaction? I've spent so many years believing that I needed to change fundamentally before I could participate in the world. But what if the world has spaces for people like me? What if I've been looking in the wrong places, trying to fit into social situations that were never going to work, instead of finding environments where my natural strengths could flourish? Tyler's sister survived high school with social anxiety and went on to college. Mr. Rodriguez thinks I could have a real career in science. Jessica wants to understand my boundaries instead of pushing past them. Maybe there are other people who would appreciate my careful way of moving through the world instead of seeing it as something that needs to be fixed. Emma saved the document and leaned back in her chair, feeling something she hadn't experienced in years, genuine optimism about her future. The writing club invitation still terrified her, but for the first time, the terror was balanced by curiosity. What would it feel like to share her words with people who might understand them? What would it feel like to connect with others through the medium that felt most natural to her? Outside her window, the October evening was settling over Millbrook, streetlights beginning to flicker on as shadows lengthened across the familiar landscape of her childhood. Tomorrow would bring another day of careful navigation through social situations, but tonight Emma allowed herself to imagine possibilities she'd never dared consider before. Change, she was learning, didn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it arrived quietly, disguised as ordinary conversations and small acts of kindness, planting seeds in the fertile ground of a ready heart and waiting patiently for the courage to bloom. The seed that Mr. Davidson had planted was growing stronger, fed by the day's accumulation of understanding and acceptance. For the first time in her 17 years, Emma Patterson was beginning to believe that she might have something valuable to offer the world, not despite her quiet, careful nature, but because of it. Wednesday arrived with unusual warmth for late October, the kind of unexpected reprieve that made Pennsylvania autumns memorable. Emma woke earlier than usual, her internal clock disrupted by the anxiety and anticipation that had been building since her conversation with Mr. Davidson 2 days prior. Today was the day the writing club met after school, and she still hadn't decided whether she would actually attend. She'd spent the previous evening drafting and redrafting a short story in her head, something she might share if she found the courage to walk into that classroom. But every time she imagined actually reading her words aloud to strangers, her chest tightened with familiar panic. What if they didn't understand? What if they thought her writing was as awkward and uncomfortable as her social interactions? Downstairs, her parents were sharing their morning coffee and newspaper, a ritual that had remained constant throughout Emma's childhood. Her father looked up as she entered the kitchen, noting the tension in her shoulders with the perceptive eye of someone who shared her tendency toward anxiety. "Big day today?" he asked gently. Emma poured herself orange juice, considering how much to reveal. Her parents knew about her academic successes but had little insight into her internal struggles beyond the obvious social difficulties. "Maybe," she said finally. "There's something I'm thinking about doing after school." "Something good, I hope?" Linda asked, looking up from the local news section. "I think so. I'm just not sure I'm brave enough." Robert folded his section of the newspaper and gave his daughter his full attention. "You know, sweetheart, courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about deciding that something is worth doing despite the fear." The words settled into Emma's chest, simple but profound. She'd always thought courage meant the absence of anxiety, but maybe it meant something different. Maybe it meant acknowledging the fear and choosing to act anyway. The drive to school felt different today, charged with possibility and terror in equal measure. Emma found herself taking mental inventory of the small victories of the past few days. Tyler's understanding, Jessica's accommodation, her successful participation in history class, Mr. Rodriguez's encouragement about her future. Each interaction had been a tiny step outside her comfort zone, and she'd survived them all. First period AP English passed in a blur of discussion about symbolism in The Great Gatsby. Emma participated more than usual, offering 2 thoughtful observations that earned approving nods from Mr. Davidson and engaged responses from her classmates. She was beginning to realize that her careful analytical thinking was actually valued in academic settings, that her tendency to observe and reflect before speaking often led to insights that others missed. "Excellent point about the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg serving as a moral compass in a morally ambiguous world," Mr. Davidson said after Emma's latest contribution. "That's exactly the kind of sophisticated literary analysis that demonstrates real understanding of Fitzgerald's themes." Emma felt the familiar flush of academic pride, but today it was accompanied by something new, a growing sense that her voice might actually be worth hearing. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. During the break between classes, Jessica fell into step beside Emma as they walked toward the science wing. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," Jessica said, "about seeing patterns and connections. I was wondering if you'd want to be study partners for the upcoming history exam. I'm good at memorizing facts, but you're really good at understanding how everything fits together." The invitation caught Emma off guard. In her experience, study partnerships were usually formed between close friends rather than offered to quiet outsiders. But Jessica's tone was genuinely interested rather than pitying, suggesting that she saw real value in Emma's analytical skills. "I'd like that," Emma replied, surprising herself with how quickly the words came. "Great. We could meet at the library after school tomorrow, or—" Jessica paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "We could study at my house if you'd be comfortable with that. My mom always makes too much food and she loves having people over." The offer of studying at Jessica's house sent anxiety spiraling through Emma's system. New environments, meeting parents, navigating unfamiliar social dynamics, it all felt overwhelming. But there was something appealing about the idea, too. The possibility of friendship extending beyond the carefully structured boundaries of school. "Could we start with the library?" Emma asked. "I'm better in familiar places." "Of course," Jessica said immediately. "The library's perfect. Quieter anyway." Emma appreciated that Jessica didn't push for an explanation or try to convince her that her house would be fun. The easy acceptance of her boundaries, without judgment or frustration, felt like a small miracle. Chemistry class passed productively, with Emma and Sarah completing another successful lab partnership. As they cleaned their workstation, Sarah made an observation that stuck with Emma throughout the day. "You know what I like about working with you?" Sarah said. "You actually listen to what I'm saying, instead of just waiting for your turn to talk. Most people don't really listen." The comment highlighted something Emma had never considered a strength: her natural tendency to focus completely on what others were saying, rather than planning her own response. It was a byproduct of her social anxiety, the careful attention she paid to others' words and body language in an effort to navigate interactions safely. But Sarah was right that it made her a better collaborator. Lunchtime found Emma in her usual corner of the library, but today Mrs. Kowalski approached her table with a gentle smile. "Emma, dear, I hope you don't mind me saying, but you seem different this week. Lighter somehow." Emma looked up from her sandwich, considering the observation. "I think I'm starting to understand some things about myself," she said slowly. "Good things, I mean. That's wonderful. Self-understanding is one of life's greatest gifts." Mrs. Kowalski paused, then continued thoughtfully. "You know, I've been the librarian here for 15 years. and I've watched a lot of students discover who they really are. The quiet ones often surprise everyone, including themselves, with how much they have to offer. Do you really think so? I know so. Some of the most insightful, creative, and thoughtful people I've known have been the ones who spent their teenage years feeling like outsiders. There's value in observing and thinking deeply and moving through the world with care and intention. Mrs. Kowalski's words echoed in Emma's mind throughout the afternoon. The idea that her careful, observant nature might be an asset rather than a liability was still new enough to feel revolutionary. She'd spent so many years believing that she needed to become more outgoing, more socially confident, more like everyone else. But what if the goal wasn't to change who she was, but to find places where who she was naturally could flourish? The final bell of the day rang at 3:15, and Emma found herself standing in the hallway as students streamed past her toward the exits. Most were eager to escape the building, to begin their after-school activities or simply enjoy their freedom. But Emma remained frozen, caught between the familiar safety of routine and the terrifying possibility of growth. The writing club met in Mr. Davidson's classroom at 3:30. She had 15 minutes to decide whether she was brave enough to walk through that door. Emma made her way slowly through the emptying building, her footsteps echoing in corridors that felt different without their usual chaos of teenage energy. She paused outside Mr. Davidson's classroom, listening to the quiet voices within. Through the small window in the door, she could see 4 students arranged in a loose circle, their chairs pulled close together in the casual intimacy of people comfortable with each other. Her first instinct was to flee. These people knew each other, had established relationships and inside jokes and shared references. She would be the awkward outsider, the one who didn't belong, the one who would disrupt their comfortable dynamic. But then she remembered her father's words from that morning. Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about deciding that something is worth doing despite the fear. Was this worth doing? Was the possibility of finding people who understood her love of words, who might appreciate her careful way of thinking, worth the terror of putting herself in a vulnerable position? Emma raised her hand to knock, then hesitated. Through the window, she could see Mr. Davidson gesturing animatedly as he spoke to the group, his passion for literature evident in every movement. One of the students, a girl Emma recognized from her AP history class but had never spoken to, was laughing at something he'd said, her whole face lighting up with genuine joy. The scene looked warm, welcoming, safe, but appearance and reality didn't always align, and Emma had been disappointed too many times to trust first impressions. She was still standing in the hallway, paralyzed by indecision, when the door opened from the inside. "Emma!" Mr. Davidson's face broke into a genuine smile of surprise and pleasure. "I wasn't sure you'd come. Please, join us." The invitation was offered without pressure, with the same patient understanding he'd shown throughout the week. Emma could still walk away, could make an excuse about forgetting something or needing to get home, but the warmth in his voice, the lack of judgment in his expression, gave her the courage to take a single step forward. "I'm not sure I belong here," she said quietly. "The only requirement for belonging here is caring about words," Mr. Davidson replied. "And I know you do." Emma took another step, then another, until she found herself inside the classroom. The 4 other students looked up with curious but friendly expressions, and she recognized 3 of them: Maria Santos from her AP history class, David Chen, Jessica's younger brother from her grade but different classes, and 2 seniors she knew by sight but had never spoken to, Alex Rivera and Sophie Martinez. "Everyone, this is Emma," Mr. Davidson said as he pulled up an additional chair. "Emma's writing shows real insight and originality. I think you'll appreciate her perspective." Emma settled into the chair, acutely aware of her racing heartbeat and sweaty palms. The circle felt intimate and exposed at the same time, nothing like the protective anonymity of regular classroom seating. "We were just discussing this week's writing prompt," Maria said, her voice friendly and welcoming. "Mr. Davidson asked us to write about a moment when silence said more than words could." Emma felt a flicker of interest, despite her anxiety. The prompt spoke directly to her experience of moving through the world, of all the things she felt but couldn't say, of the weight of unspoken thoughts and unexpressed emotions. "Did you write something for the prompt?" David asked. "We'd love to hear it, but no pressure if you're not ready to share." The offer was made with the same gentle consideration Jessica had shown, acknowledging Emma's boundaries while leaving space for participation. Emma reached into her backpack and pulled out the story she'd been working on for weeks, the one about the girl who could only communicate through written letters. "I have something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I've never read my writing aloud before." "First times are always scary," Sophie said kindly, "but this is a safe space. We're here because we love stories, not to judge them." Alex nodded in agreement. "Some of my best writing comes from the scariest emotions. Fear usually means you're writing about something that matters." Emma looked around the circle, seeing genuine encouragement in every face. These weren't the popular kids who dominated most social situations, she realized. These were the thoughtful ones, the ones who found meaning in words and stories rather than social hierarchies. "Would it help if I read it?" Mr. Davidson offered. "Sometimes it's easier to hear your own words in someone else's voice first." Emma shook her head, surprising herself. "I think I need to do it myself." She unfolded the pages, hands trembling slightly, and began to read. In the world of Chromata, everyone spoke in colors and music. Conversations bloomed in rainbow cascades, arguments clashed in discordant symphonies, and laughter sparkled like golden wind chimes in summer breezes. Everyone, that is, except for Arya. Arya could only communicate through written letters, words appearing on paper in simple black ink, while the rest of the world painted their thoughts in brilliant hues and melodic phrases. She watched from the margins as others danced their conversations, their emotions flowing seamlessly from one person to another in streams of light and sound. At first, Arya believed she was broken, a mistake in a world designed for people more vibrant than herself. She tried to learn the language of colors, practicing rainbow scales until her fingers ached, but her words stubbornly remained black marks on white paper. She attempted to join the musical conversations, humming tentatively along with the symphonic discussions, but her voice produced only silence. But then, Arya met an old woman in the market who spoke only in whispers. The woman's colors were faded, her music barely audible, and she seemed as out of place as Arya felt. When Arya offered her a written note, a simple observation about the beauty of the sunrise, the woman's eyes filled with tears. "I had forgotten," the woman wrote back, "that words could exist without sound, that thoughts could be beautiful in their quietness. In all this noise and color, I had lost the music of stillness." From that day forward, Arya began to understand that her letters weren't a limitation, but a different kind of gift. Her words had weight and permanence that spoken colors could never achieve. People could hold her thoughts, carry them home, return to them in moments of need. Her silence wasn't empty. It was full of all the things that didn't need to be said aloud to be understood. Emma's voice grew stronger as she read, the familiar words flowing more easily than she'd expected. When she finished, the classroom was quiet for a long moment. Not the uncomfortable silence of awkwardness, but the thoughtful quiet of people processing something meaningful. "That was beautiful," Maria said finally. "The metaphor of different communication styles as different languages. It's so clever, but also really moving. I love how you turned what seemed like a disability into a unique strength," David added. "The idea that written words have permanence and weight that spoken words don't. That's really profound." Alex leaned forward in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "It reminds me of how I feel sometimes as a writer, like I can express things on paper that I could never say out loud. Like writing is my native language, even though everyone else is speaking something different." Sophie nodded enthusiastically. "And the old woman character, she represents all the people who might be overlooked in a world that values loudness over depth. It's such a compassionate story." Mr. Davidson's smile was proud and knowing. "This is exactly what I meant about sophisticated literary thinking, Emma. You've created an allegory that works on multiple levels: personal, social, philosophical. It's the kind of writing that stays with readers long after they've finished reading." Emma felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with recognition. These people understood her story, saw the layers of meaning she'd woven into the narrative, appreciated the careful construction of metaphor and theme. For the first time in her life, she felt truly seen, not for what she couldn't do, but for what she could. "Would you be interested in developing this into a longer piece?" Mr. Davidson asked. "Maybe exploring more of Arya's world, showing how she builds connections with others who communicate differently?" The suggestion sparked immediate interest in Emma's mind. She could envision expanding the story, creating a whole society of people with different communication gifts, exploring how understanding and accommodation could bridge seemingly impossible gaps. "I'd like that," she said, and meant it. The conversation continued for another 40 minutes, with each member sharing pieces of their own writing and offering thoughtful feedback to the others. Emma found herself contributing more than she'd expected, her analytical skills translating naturally to literary discussion. When someone shared a poem about family expectations, she offered insights about metaphor and structure. When David read a humorous piece about teenage social dynamics, she commented on his effective use of irony. As the meeting wound down, Emma realized she'd been so engaged in the discussions that she'd forgotten to be anxious. The terror that had paralyzed her outside the classroom door seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the satisfaction of intellectual connection and creative community. "Same time next week?" Mr. Davidson asked as students began gathering their belongings. "Definitely," Emma replied without hesitation. Maria turned to her as they walked toward the door. "I'm really glad you came today. Your story was exactly what I needed to hear. I've been feeling like I don't fit in anywhere, but your writing reminded me that maybe I just haven't found my people yet." The comment hit Emma like a gentle revelation. Her writing hadn't just been understood, it had actually helped someone else feel less alone. The idea that her words could offer comfort and connection to another person was more powerful than any academic praise she'd ever received. As she walked through the empty hallways toward the parking lot, Emma felt lighter than she had in years. The building that had always felt like a social minefield now seemed full of unexpected possibilities. She'd found a group of people who valued thoughtful observation over performative socializing, who appreciated careful analysis over quick wit, who understood that meaningful connection could happen through shared love of stories and words. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "How was your day, sweetheart?" For once, Emma didn't respond with her automatic, "Fine." Instead, she typed, "Really good. I joined the writing club and shared a story I've been working on. People understood it." Her mother's response came quickly. "That's wonderful. I'm so proud of you for trying something new. Can't wait to hear all about it." The drive home took Emma through downtown Millbrook, but today the familiar streets felt different, less like a trap and more like a foundation, a stable base from which she could venture out into new experiences. She'd spent so many years seeing her hometown's intimacy as a limitation, but maybe it was actually a gift. Maybe having a safe place to return to made it easier to take risks, to try new things, to grow beyond the boundaries she'd set for herself. At home, she found her parents in the kitchen, her father reading emails while her mother prepared dinner. Their faces lit up when she walked in, and Emma realized they'd been waiting to hear about her day with the kind of hopeful anxiety that parents feel when their children attempt something challenging. "Tell us about the writing club," Linda said immediately, abandoning her dinner preparations to give Emma her full attention. Emma settled at the kitchen counter, surprised by her own eagerness to share. "It was scary at first," she admitted, "but the people there are really thoughtful. They listen to each other's writing and offer helpful feedback instead of just trying to be clever or critical." "Did you share something?" Robert asked gently. "I read a story I've been working on, about a girl who communicates differently than everyone else around her. They understood what I was trying to say." Emma paused, still amazed by the afternoon's revelations. "Mr. Davidson thinks I should develop it into something longer." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Linda said, her voice warm with pride. "I've always known you had a gift with words, but it sounds like you're finally finding people who can appreciate it." "It felt good to have my thoughts valued," Emma said. "Like maybe I don't need to change who I am to contribute something meaningful." Robert looked up from his phone, his expression soft with understanding. "You've never needed to change who you are, Emma. You just needed to find the right environment for your particular gifts to flourish." That evening, Emma sat at her desk working on her homework, but her mind kept returning to the writing club meeting. She found herself outlining ideas for expanding Arya's story, imagining new characters with different communication gifts, exploring how a society might adapt to honor diverse ways of connecting and understanding. She opened a new document on her laptop and began writing. "Today I learned that courage isn't about becoming someone different. It's about having the bravery to let people see who you really are. For 17 years I've been hiding parts of myself that I thought were unacceptable. My need for quiet, my discomfort with casual touch, my preference for deep conversations over small talk. But today I shared a story that came directly from those hidden parts of myself, and people didn't just accept it. They understood it, valued it, connected with it. Maybe the goal isn't to become more like everyone else. Maybe the goal is to find spaces where being exactly like myself is not just acceptable but valued." Today I found one of those spaces, and it felt like coming home to a place I'd never been before. The writing club isn't just about writing, it's about being seen and understood for who you really are. It's about discovering that the things that make you different might actually be the things that make you valuable. It's about learning that connection doesn't require you to sacrifice authenticity. I'm still anxious about social interactions. I still prefer solitude to crowds, still jump when people touch me unexpectedly, still struggle with casual conversation. But for the first time, I don't see these characteristics as flaws that need to be corrected. They're just part of how I'm built, and there are places in the world where that's perfectly okay. Emma saved the document and leaned back in her chair, feeling a sense of completion that had nothing to do with finished homework and everything to do with finished hiding. She'd spent years believing that she needed to wait until she was different, better, more socially confident before she could participate meaningfully in the world. But today she'd learned that the world had been waiting for her exactly as she was. Outside her window, the October evening was settling over Millbrook with the kind of gentle beauty that made small towns famous. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to practice courage, new chances to connect with others through the medium of words and stories. But tonight, Emma Patterson was exactly where she belonged, in her own room, in her own thoughts, planning stories that might help other people feel less alone in the world. The seed that Mr. Davidson had planted was no longer just growing, it was beginning to bloom, sending out shoots of confidence and connection that would reshape how Emma moved through the world. She was still the quiet girl in the back of the classroom, still the one who preferred observation to participation, still the careful analyst who thought before she spoke. But now she knew that these characteristics weren't obstacles to overcome. They were strengths to cultivate, gifts to share with a world that desperately needed more thoughtfulness, more empathy, more people willing to listen deeply and speak carefully. For the first time in her life, Emma Patterson was proud to be exactly who she was. 3 weeks after joining the writing club, Emma found herself looking forward to Wednesdays with an anticipation that still surprised her. The terror that had once accompanied any voluntary social interaction had been replaced by something she'd never experienced before. Genuine excitement about sharing her thoughts with people who understood her. The November morning was crisp and clear, with the kind of bright autumn sunshine that made even familiar places look magical. Emma stood at her bedroom window, watching frost sparkle on the grass in her backyard, and felt a contentment that ran deeper than temporary happiness. She was beginning to understand the difference between surviving and thriving, between existing safely in the margins and actively participating in her own life. Her reflection in the window showed subtle changes that had accumulated over the past month. She still wore her hair loose around her face, still chose clothes that allowed her to blend into backgrounds, but there was something different in her posture, less hunched, more open. Her eyes held a clarity that hadn't been there before, the look of someone who was beginning to see herself clearly. Downstairs, her parents were sharing their morning routine with an ease that came from years of practice, but Emma noticed that they watched her differently now, with less worry and more curiosity, as if they too were discovering who their daughter might become when given space to grow. "Big day today?" her father asked as she joined them in the kitchen. "Actually, yes," Emma replied, accepting a glass of orange juice from her mother. "I'm presenting my expanded story to the writing club this afternoon, and Jessica and I are meeting during lunch to work on our history project." The casual mention of social plans still felt surreal to Emma. A month ago, her days had been carefully structured to minimize human interaction beyond the academic necessities. Now she found herself scheduling meetings, making plans, even looking forward to collaborative work. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Linda said, her voice warm with pride. "It sounds like you're really finding your place." Emma considered the phrase as she gathered her school supplies. Finding her place, was that what had happened? She'd always assumed that fitting in required changing herself to match external expectations. But the writing club had taught her something different, that belonging meant finding people who appreciated her authentic self, rather than people who wanted her to be someone else. The drive to school felt routine now, no longer requiring the mental preparation and anxiety management that had once consumed her mornings. Emma had developed new patterns over the past month, arriving a few minutes earlier to chat with Mr. Davidson before class, stopping by the library to say hello to Mrs. Kowalski, even making eye contact and exchanging greetings with classmates she'd previously avoided. In AP English, she'd become a regular contributor to class discussions, offering insights that earned respect from both teacher and peers. Her careful analytical thinking, once hidden behind layers of social anxiety, was now recognized as one of her greatest academic strengths. Today we're beginning our unit on contemporary American poetry, Mr. Davidson announced as students settled into their seats. I want to start by exploring how modern poets use personal experience to illuminate universal themes. Emma felt the familiar flutter of interest that came with literary analysis. Poetry had always appealed to her because of its precision, the way poets could distill complex emotions into carefully chosen words. It felt similar to her own approach to communication, economical, thoughtful, weighted with meaning. Who can give me an example of a contemporary poet who transforms personal narrative into something universally resonant? Mr. Davidson asked. Emma's hand went up automatically, no longer requiring the internal debate that had once preceded any voluntary participation. Maya Angelou, she said when called upon. Her autobiographical poems about overcoming trauma and finding voice speak to anyone who's ever felt silenced or marginalized. Excellent example, Mr. Davidson replied. Angelou demonstrates how individual experience can become a vehicle for exploring broader human themes. Her personal story of finding voice becomes everyone's story of finding voice. The comment resonated with Emma in a way that felt deeply personal. Her own story, the quiet girl learning to share her thoughts, the anxious teenager discovering that her perspective had value, was becoming part of a larger narrative about finding courage and authentic self-expression. Jessica, who sat 2 rows ahead, turned around to catch Emma's eye and smiled. Their friendship had developed slowly over the past month, built on shared intellectual interests and Jessica's intuitive understanding of Emma's need for gentle, non-pressuring social interaction. They'd become study partners, then lunch companions, and finally genuine friends who could sit together in comfortable silence or engage in deep conversations about books, ideas, and the complexities of teenage life. During the break between classes, Jessica fell into step beside Emma as they walked toward the science wing. I finished reading the expanded version of your Arya story, Jessica said. The new characters you've added are amazing. I especially love Whisper, the boy who communicates through touch but only with consent. It's such a beautiful metaphor for healthy boundaries. Emma felt the familiar flush of pride that came with having her work understood and appreciated. Over the past month, she'd shared several stories with the writing club, each one exploring different aspects of communication, connection, and belonging. The feedback had been consistently thoughtful and encouraging, helping her develop confidence in her creative voice. I've been thinking about turning it into a series, Emma admitted. Maybe exploring a whole community of people with different communication gifts, showing how they build understanding across their differences. That would be incredible. You could probably publish something like that. It's exactly the kind of diverse representation that publishers are looking for. The suggestion of publication sent a thrill of possibility through Emma's chest. She'd never seriously considered that her writing might have value beyond the classroom, but the encouragement from her writing club peers had begun to shift her perspective. Maybe her stories could reach people beyond Millbrook, could offer comfort and recognition to other quiet souls who felt like outsiders in their own lives. Chemistry class continued to be a source of confidence for Emma. Her partnership with Sarah had evolved into an easy collaboration based on mutual respect and complementary skills. But more importantly, Mr. Rodriguez had begun including Emma in advanced discussions about research opportunities and college preparation. Emma, could you stay after class for a few minutes? Mr. Rodriguez asked as students began packing up their materials. I have something I'd like to discuss with you. Emma's automatic anxiety response had diminished significantly over the past month, replaced by curiosity rather than fear when teachers requested private conversations. She waited as the classroom emptied, then approached Mr. Rodriguez's desk with calm attention. I've been in touch with a colleague at Penn State who runs a summer research program for high school students interested in environmental chemistry, he said, pulling out a folder of information. It's highly competitive, but I think you'd be an excellent candidate. The program focuses on water quality analysis and environmental impact assessment, right in line with your interests. Emma accepted the folder, feeling a flutter of excitement as she scanned the program description. The idea of spending a summer doing real research, contributing to environmental protection efforts, aligned perfectly with her growing sense of academic purpose. Do you really think I'd have a chance? She asked. I think you'd have an excellent chance. Your analytical skills, attention to detail, and ability to work independently are exactly what research requires. Plus, your writing abilities would be a huge asset for preparing reports and presentations. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Mr. Rodriguez outlining the application process and offering to write a recommendation letter. As Emma left the classroom, she felt a sense of possibility that extended far beyond high school. For the first time, she could envision a future where her natural strengths would be not just accepted, but actively sought after. Lunchtime brought her regular meeting with Jessica in the library. They'd been working on a collaborative history project about social movements in 1960s America, combining Jessica's talent for research with Emma's gift for analysis and synthesis. Their partnership had become a model of successful academic collaboration, earning praise from Mrs. Chen and serving as an example for other students. "I found some incredible primary source documents about the Freedom Riders," Jessica said as they settled at their usual table. "Personal letters and diary entries that really show the human cost of fighting for civil rights." Emma reviewed the materials, immediately seeing connections and patterns that would strengthen their analysis. "These would work perfectly with the newspaper accounts we found last week," she said. "We could structure the presentation around the contrast between public narratives and private experiences." They worked together for 40 minutes, their different strengths creating a synergy that produced work better than either could have accomplished alone. Emma had come to appreciate not just Jessica's research skills, but her ability to ask questions that pushed their analysis deeper, to challenge assumptions in ways that led to more nuanced understanding. "You know what I love about working with you?" Jessica said as they prepared to leave for their next classes. "You see things from angles I never would have considered. Like last week when you connected the lunch counter sit-ins to contemporary workplace discrimination. I never would have made that connection." "I like seeing how things connect across time," Emma replied. "How the same human struggles show up in different contexts. That's going to make you an amazing researcher someday, whether it's in science or history or whatever field you choose." The afternoon's classes passed quickly, with Emma participating actively in discussions and feeling increasingly comfortable with her role as a thoughtful contributor rather than silent observer. In AP History, she offered an analysis of Cold War rhetoric that earned extended discussion from the class. In AP Literature, she shared an insight about symbolism in contemporary poetry that sparked an engaging debate about authorial intent versus reader interpretation. As the final bell rang, Emma felt the familiar anticipation that came with Wednesday afternoons. The writing club had become the highlight of her week, a place where her most authentic self could exist without apology or explanation. She arrived at Mr. Davidson's classroom to find the usual group assembled in their comfortable circle. Over the past month, the dynamic had evolved to include Emma as a full participant, rather than a nervous newcomer. Maria, David, Alex, and Sophie had become genuine friends, people who shared her love of words and stories, who appreciated her quiet insights and thoughtful questions. "Emma's brought her expanded aria story today," Mr. Davidson announced as she settled into her chair. "I've had the privilege of reading drafts, and I think you're all going to be impressed by how she's developed the world and characters." Emma felt nervous but not terrified as she pulled out her printed pages. The fear of judgment had been replaced by excitement about sharing her creative work with people who would understand and appreciate it. "This is the third installment in what's becoming a series," she said, her voice steady and clear. "It introduces a new character called Echo, who communicates through reflected emotions. She can only express her own feelings by mirroring what others are experiencing." She began to read, her voice growing stronger with each paragraph. The story explored themes of empathy and emotional boundaries, following Echo as she learned to distinguish her own feelings from those she absorbed from others. It was Emma's most personal work yet, drawing on her own experience of being highly sensitive to others' emotions while struggling to identify and express her own. When she finished, the group was quiet for a long moment, the thoughtful silence that had become familiar to Emma, indicating that her words had resonated deeply. "That was incredibly powerful," Maria said finally. "The way you showed Echo learning to set emotional boundaries while still maintaining her gift for empathy. It felt so real and necessary." Alex nodded enthusiastically. "I love how you're building this entire world where different ways of experiencing and expressing emotion are all valued. It's like a utopian vision of neurodiversity." The scene where Echo realizes she can help others understand their own emotions by reflecting them back, that was beautiful, Sophie added. It showed how what seems like a limitation can actually be a profound gift. David leaned forward in his chair, his expression thoughtful. This whole series is becoming something really special, Emma. Have you thought about what you want to do with it when it's finished? Emma had been wondering the same thing. The stories felt too important to keep hidden in her computer files, but the idea of sharing them with a wider audience still felt overwhelming. Mr. Davidson suggested I might submit something to the state writing competition, she said carefully, but I'm not sure I'm ready for that kind of exposure. What would make you feel ready? Mr. Davidson asked gently. What would need to change for you to feel confident about sharing your work more widely? Emma considered the question seriously. A month ago, the answer would have been simple. Everything would need to change. She would need to become more confident, more socially skilled, more like other people. But now she understood that readiness wasn't about transformation. It was about acceptance. I think I need to trust that the right people will understand what I'm trying to say, she said slowly, and accept that not everyone will, and that's okay too. That's exactly the right perspective, Mr. Davidson replied. Great writing always finds its audience, even if that audience isn't everyone. The conversation continued for another hour, with each member sharing updates on their current projects and offering feedback on works in progress. Emma found herself contributing as actively as anyone else, her insights valued and her questions welcomed. When Maria shared a poem about feeling invisible in her large family, Emma offered observations about imagery and metaphor that helped Maria see new possibilities for revision. When Alex read a humorous piece about teenage awkwardness, Emma's comments about character development sparked a productive discussion about authentic dialogue. As the meeting wound down, Sophie made an announcement that surprised everyone. I've been thinking about something, she said, her voice carrying a note of excitement. What if we put together a collection of our best work and tried to get it published? Like a small anthology of local young writers? The suggestion sent a thrill of possibility through the group. Emma felt her heart rate accelerate, but this time it was excitement rather than anxiety. That's a brilliant idea, David said immediately. We could each contribute 2 or 3 pieces, maybe organize them around themes. I know someone who works at the community college literary magazine, Alex added. She might be able to give us advice about the submission process. Emma found herself speaking before she could second-guess the impulse. I'd like to be part of that, she said. It's scary, but it feels like the right kind of scary. Mr. Davidson's smile was proud and knowing. I think an anthology is a wonderful idea. And Emma, I'm particularly pleased to hear you describe something as the right kind of scary. That suggests you're learning to distinguish between fear that protects you and fear that limits you. The distinction resonated deeply with Emma. She was beginning to understand that not all fear was created equal, that some anxiety served to keep her safe while other anxiety simply kept her small. Learning to tell the difference was becoming one of her most important life skills. As the group made plans for their anthology project, Emma felt a sense of belonging that went beyond temporary comfort. These people didn't just accept her quirks and limitations, they valued her contributions, appreciated her perspective, and wanted to help her share her gifts with the world. The meeting ended with everyone exchanging contact information and making plans to meet the following week, to discuss their anthology idea in more detail. As Emma gathered her belongings, Maria approached her with a shy smile. I wanted to thank you for your feedback on my poem today, Maria said. You helped me see things I never would have noticed on my own. You have such a gift for understanding what writers are trying to say, even when they're not saying it clearly. I just pay attention to details, Emma replied. I think it comes from spending so much time observing instead of talking. That's exactly what makes you such a good critic. You really listen, really see. That's rare. As Emma walked through the empty school corridors toward the parking lot, she reflected on how much had changed in just 1 month. The building that had once felt like a social obstacle course now felt like a place of possibility and growth. She'd found her people, discovered her voice, and begun to envision a future where her authentic self could flourish. The drive home took her through downtown Millbrook, past the familiar storefronts and tree-lined streets that had formed the backdrop of her entire life. But today, instead of feeling trapped by small-town limitations, she saw foundation and stability. Millbrook had given her a safe place to grow, supportive adults who recognized her potential, and the time she needed to discover who she really was. At home, she found her parents in the living room, her father reading while her mother worked on a quilting project. They looked up expectantly as she entered, and Emma realized they'd been waiting to hear about her day with the kind of interested attention that parents reserve for children who are thriving. "How was the writing club?" Linda asked, setting aside her needlework. "Really good," Emma replied, settling into her favorite armchair. "We're going to put together an anthology of our work and try to get it published. And Mr. Rodriguez thinks I should apply for a summer research program at Penn State." She shared the details of her day, surprised by her own eagerness to communicate her experiences. Her parents listened with the kind of focused attention that made her feel valued and understood, asking thoughtful questions and offering encouragement without overwhelming her with excessive enthusiasm. "It sounds like you're discovering all sorts of possibilities," Robert said when she'd finished. "Academic opportunities, creative projects, meaningful friendships. That's exactly what the teenage years should be about, figuring out who you are and what you want to contribute to the world." "I feel like I'm finally becoming myself," Emma said, the words carrying a weight of recognition and relief. "Not trying to be someone else, just becoming who I was meant to be all along." That evening, Emma sat at her desk working on a new story for the anthology project. This one was different from her previous work, less metaphorical, more directly autobiographical. It told the story of a teenage girl who discovered that her quiet nature wasn't a flaw to be corrected, but a strength to be cultivated, that her careful way of moving through the world had value and purpose. As she wrote, Emma found herself thinking about all the people who had helped her reach this point of self-acceptance. Mr. Davidson, who had seen her potential and created opportunities for her to share it. Jessica, who had offered friendship without trying to change her. Tyler, who had validated her boundaries and acknowledged her worth. Her parents, who had loved her consistently even when they didn't understand her. Mrs. Kowalski, who had provided quiet sanctuary and gentle encouragement. But most importantly, Emma was beginning to understand that the most crucial relationship in her life was the one she had with herself. For 17 years, she'd been her own harshest critic, focusing on everything she couldn't do rather than appreciating what she could, learning to see herself through kinder eyes, to value her own thoughts and feelings, to believe that her voice mattered. That was the foundation that made all other connections possible. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "Can't wait to read what you're working on for the anthology. Your stories always make me feel less alone in the world." The message filled Emma with a warmth that had nothing to do with external validation, and everything to do with the recognition that her words could offer comfort and connection to others. She'd spent so many years believing that she had nothing valuable to contribute, but now she understood that her careful observations, her emotional insights, her ability to translate complex feelings into precise language, these were gifts that the world needed. She texted back, "Thank you for helping me find the courage to share them." As Emma continued writing, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment of clarity and purpose. It hadn't been a dramatic transformation. No single event had changed everything. Instead, it had been an accumulation of small acts of courage, tiny steps outside her comfort zone, moments of choosing growth over safety. The girl who had violently recoiled from Jessica's friendly touch just a month ago was still anxious about unexpected contact. The student who had sat silent in the back of every classroom was still more comfortable listening than speaking. The teenager who had eaten lunch alone in the library still preferred solitude to large groups. But now Emma understood that these characteristics weren't obstacles to overcome. They were simply part of how she was built, and there were places in the world where that was not just acceptable, but valuable. She'd found some of those places already. The writing club where her insights were appreciated, the chemistry lab where her attention to detail was an asset, the friendship with Jessica where her thoughtful nature was welcomed. And she was beginning to believe that there would be others. College classrooms where careful analysis was rewarded, research laboratories where methodical thinking was essential, writing communities where authentic voice was celebrated. The world was vast and varied enough to contain spaces for people like her, places where being thoughtful and observant and quietly persistent were exactly the right qualities for success. Outside her window, the November evening was settling over Millbrook with the peaceful quiet of a small town at rest. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to practice courage, new chances to share her voice, new possibilities for connection and growth. But tonight, Emma Patterson was exactly where she belonged, in her own room, in her own thoughts, writing stories that might help other quiet souls feel less alone in the world. The seed that Mr. Davidson had planted had grown into something beautiful and strong. sending out roots of confidence and branches of connection that would continue to grow throughout her life. Emma was still the careful observer, still the thoughtful analyst, still the girl who preferred depth over breadth in her relationships. But now she knew that these weren't limitations to overcome. They were strengths to cultivate, gifts to share with a world that desperately needed more people willing to listen deeply, think carefully, and speak truthfully. For the first time in her 17 years, Emma Patterson was not just surviving, she was thriving, blooming into the person she was always meant to become. And that person, she was discovering, was pretty wonderful just as she was. The anthology project would be submitted in the spring. The summer research program application was due in February. College applications would come senior year, followed by new environments and fresh challenges. But Emma no longer approached the future with fear and uncertainty. She approached it with curiosity and hope, knowing that wherever she went, whatever she chose to do, she would bring with her the most important discovery of her young life, the knowledge that she was enough, exactly as she was, and that the world had been waiting for her voice all along. As she saved her work and prepared for bed, Emma felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this place of self-acceptance and authentic connection. The quiet girl in the back of the classroom had found her voice, not by becoming someone different, but by learning to value the person she had always been. And that voice, careful and thoughtful and quietly powerful, was ready to speak truths that only she could tell, to offer comfort and understanding to others who were still learning that it was okay to be exactly who they were. The story wasn't ending. It was just beginning. What did you think of Emma's journey from isolation to self-acceptance? Her story reminds us that sometimes our greatest strengths are hidden behind what we think are our weaknesses. If Emma's transformation touched your heart, or if you've ever felt like the quiet observer trying to find your place in the world, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Share your own experiences with finding courage, discovering your voice, or learning to embrace who you truly are. Don't forget to hit that like button if this story resonated with you, and subscribe for more inspiring tales about young people overcoming challenges and discovering their true potential. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that matter, stories that remind us we're all worthy of love and belonging, exactly as we are.